Some recent brain studies raise questions about how cleanly we can draw the line at death, almost as if the signal keeps pulsing after we think it's gone, like a Wi-Fi network you didn't realize was still connected. This isn't coming from mystical language, but from 2025 neuroscience research, including a documented case in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience, where continuous EEG recorded structured brain activity moments after clinical death. Those results pushed me to look at the rest of the data: patterns in perception, changes during grief, and quantum correlations in human consciousness labs, until one moment forced me to stop and question everything I thought I knew. The moment science got uncomfortable. For Dr. Tara Swart, the turning point didn't arrive in some dim, high-security lab, but in the plain light of an ordinary morning. Coffee cooling next to her, she opened a fresh dataset from a brainwave monitoring system. The patient's chart showed every medical sign of death: no heartbeat, no breathing, no brainstem reflexes. By every conventional teaching in neuroscience, brain activity should have been absent. Yet there, in the compressed readout, appeared slow, deliberate pulses. Not random electrical noise, but structured patterns appearing where nothing should be. They didn't resemble the chaotic bursts seen in seizures or the decay of neural tissue. In documented cases like these, the patterns fell outside anything she had been trained to expect. And they raised a bigger question: what exactly unfolds in the brain at the threshold of death? Initial suspicion fell on the equipment. Electrodes pick up interference, software misreads data, recordings can be contaminated by mechanical artifacts. But the consistency, even across separate occasions, made purely technical error harder to defend. In one instance, she heard a senior colleague quietly suggest setting it aside as post-mortem noise. It was a polite term that dismissed without explaining, illustrating what she already knew from her own field. Some subjects carry an invisible, do not touch warning because of the professional risk they bring. By early 2025, hints that her observations might be part of a wider pattern cropped up in the literature. The most prominent came in a controlled case study published in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience, led by Dr. Ijmal Zemma, with collaborators from the University of Louisville and the University of Tartu. In it, continuous EEG recorded coordinated changes in brain oscillations during the 30 seconds before and after cardiac arrest. Across gamma, delta, theta, alpha, and beta bands, the shifts were organized, not chaotic. Zemma speculated that in the living, gamma waves often relate to processes such as dreaming, memory recall, and sensory integration, raising the startling possibility that, in those final instants, the brain might be re-engaging similar networks. It was just one patient, under very specific monitoring circumstances, but paired with later reports in 2024 to 25, including results published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, noting functional connections between early visual areas and frontal regions moments after death. The single case was enough to destabilize the textbook binary between alive and gone. These later accounts remained provisional, requiring replication. Their authors avoided any claim about consciousness persisting. At most, they showed the brain doing something more complex at life's endpoint than an immediate shutdown. For Swart, this positioned her work uncomfortably close to the cultural taboo she had long been aware of. She often repeated that in scientific circles, anything that brushes against life after death is treated with suspicion, and talking about it creates reputational danger. She had even been part of psychiatric teams earlier in her career that treated reports of after-death contact strictly as symptoms to be managed, not as data to be explored. Now, faced with her own findings, she knew that ignoring them for safety's sake would also be unscientific. The context mattered. These organized oscillations challenge the simple on-off model of the dying brain, but they do not by themselves prove any ongoing subjective awareness. Elevated gamma activity could mean many things, among them the possibility, as Zemma suggested, of a last replay of life events. It could equally reflect non-conscious processing, as chemical gradients and network dynamics collapse. The key was not in declaring what it must mean, but in tightening the methodology enough to find out. In the early 2020s, advances in imaging down to the scale of single neuron clusters and more precise cross-validation protocols had raised the bar on what counted as solid evidence in neuroscience. In the 2025 Frontiers case, signals were measured not just for presence, but for coherence, the degree to which distant brain regions stayed in sync. This coherence, however fleeting, stood out because it directly conflicted with the assumption that, once circulation stops, neurons very quickly lapse into disorder. The JAMA findings added to the nuance by showing how sensory and associative areas might stay functionally linked briefly after death, hinting at a possible shift in how researchers understand consciousness, decoupling it, in part, from strictly frontal lobe processes. Still, many in the field interpreted the activity as residual reverberation, the last coordinated echo of a network losing equilibrium. Others posited that certain microenvironments, such as regions with higher tolerance for low oxygen, might allow activity to persist longer in some individuals than others. But none of these interpretations closed the discussion. In candid, off-record conference exchanges, experienced researchers admitted that these readings didn't slot neatly into existing models. Swart approached those conversations cautiously. She avoided phrases that could be seized on as sensational, anchoring every public statement to measurable results. Her goal wasn't to persuade her peers that the mind continues after death, but to carve out space where recording and publishing anomalous post-death data wasn't immediately career-ending. If history had taught neuroscience anything, it was that uncomfortable data often precedes shifts in understanding. Neuroplasticity, gut-brain independence, and mirror neurons had all once sat at the fringes before becoming accepted. What separated these recent findings from earlier, less rigorous accounts of strange brain activity after death was the context in which they were made. Continuous, high-fidelity recordings, independent verification, and careful peer review. Yet even with that foundation, the evidence remained at the level of intriguing fragments, not established law. That's why Swart insisted that the takeaway, for now, was about complexity, not certainty. The brain's final moments aren't a hard stop. They may involve ordered processes we've barely begun to map. But whether any of that order contains experience is still unknown. Framing it that way mattered, not just to keep the science intact, but because the implications touched human concerns well beyond the lab bench. If death isn't the hard line we thought it was at the neural level, then our understanding of end-of-life care, grief, and even the ethics of organ donation could shift. Swart believed that letting in a broader conversation about what these signals might, and might not, mean was the first step. And it was a step she was willing to take despite knowing how quickly colleagues might retreat from proximity to such work. The real payoff, she often noted, wouldn't come in the form of a single, definitive answer. It would come in building a clearer, more balanced view of what the science actually says so far, and in offering people ways to integrate that understanding into both their professional practice and personal lives. For viewers following along here, the next part of our story will open up a different question. If our sensory world is larger than we were taught, then the boundary between the known and the unknown, in life and perhaps in death, may be far more porous than most of us have ever considered. From 5 senses to 34, and now 37. Most of us were taught a tidy chart in school. Sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Maybe, if the teacher wanted to be intriguing, there'd be a passing nod to a so-called 6th sense. The way it's presented makes it sound final, as if those 5 cover every possible route by which the brain gathers information about the world. But that picture is far from complete. Researchers have been expanding the sensory map for decades, and by 2025, voices like neuroscientist Dr. Tara Swart had brought widespread attention to a much broader count, a framework listing 34 distinct human senses. It's not mystical in origin, but built on measurable, physiological systems, including many that operate without us being consciously aware of them. Scientists increasingly agree that the 5-sense chart is a simplification. If you count each internal physiological sensing stream as a perceptual system in its own right, the list grows quickly. Proprioception, for example, gives us a constant map of where our limbs are in space without needing to look. Interoception monitors everything from gut contractions to heart rhythms, feeding the brain status updates that can influence mood, decision-making, and even intuition. Chronoception provides our internal sense of the passage of time, shaping how we anticipate events and coordinate movement. Other well-established sensory modalities include nociception, pain, thermoception, temperature, equilibrioception, balance, and chemoreception, detecting chemical composition in the blood, such as pH shifts or oxygen levels. These are not exotic or fringe ideas. They are rooted in mainstream neuroscience. How you arrive at a number like 34 depends partly on taxonomy. Some researchers group related processes together, others split them into finer submodalities. Interoception alone can encompass multiple signal types. Stretch receptors in the stomach, baroreceptors tracking blood pressure, osmoreceptors monitoring fluid balance. If each is counted separately, the total grows. Swartz framing is essentially an expansionist proposal, a way of reminding people that what we call perception is not limited to what we can deliberately notice. It's an attempt to catalogue the genuine diversity of the information streams feeding the brain at any given moment. Crucially, many of these senses function in the background. Proprioception runs without interruption, allowing actions like walking or typing without conscious calculation. Thermoception quietly drives behavioral choices, stepping into shade or reaching for a jumper, often before we think about it. Even changes in blood CO2 levels can prompt adjustments in breathing rhythm well before the feeling of breathlessness hits consciousness. These are continuous inputs, functioning as part of what shapes our lived reality, without showing up as a distinct feeling we can name on demand. Placing these alongside the 5 traditionally taught senses reframes how we think about perception. The brain is not a passive receiver of 5 fixed channels. It's an integration hub for dozens of sources, both internal and external, many of them silent to conscious awareness. If emotional or environmental conditions change the weighting or reach of these channels, the patterns of perception that result may feel unfamiliar or heightened. That opens the door, cautiously, to hypotheses about unusual experiences, without stepping outside the boundaries of established sensory physiology. This is where speculation, clearly marked as such, comes in. If certain states, intense focus, meditative absorption, or powerful emotions, alter how the brain samples and integrates these multiple sensory streams, then it's reasonable to ask whether inputs usually below awareness might briefly surface. Such moments could create the impression of picking up on information that seems to arrive out of nowhere. Documented research already shows that emotional state can influence bodily signal processing. For example, heightened interoceptive accuracy under stress, or altered time perception in moments of fear. Extending that logic to more subtle forms of perception is intriguing, though any link to experiences outside ordinary life needs replication and rigorous control. What's important is separating the physiology from the interpretation. The existence of 30-plus senses, as physiological systems delivering information to the brain, is well supported. The idea that those senses could, under the right conditions, contribute to impressions some interpret as extraordinary is still a hypothesis. But the sensory expansion work forces a rethink of our assumptions. Much of what guides behavior and shapes experience is happening outside the conscious, 5-sense model. If you visualize this broader sensory map, it's not a simple list, but an overlapping structure. External senses like vision and hearing feed into multimodal hubs in the brainstem and cortex. Internal senses like interoception and proprioception constantly update those hubs with the body's status. Chemical sensing, thermal gradients, balance. All these contribute to a moment-by-moment state estimate that lets the brain predict and react. In this model, perception is less about passively recording what's out there, and more about actively constructing a working model of reality from dozens of inputs. This structural view matters for any discussion about altered perceptual states. If the brain's construction process can adapt, skew, or open under certain mental or emotional conditions, then what we experience as more vivid, strange, or unexpectedly clear perception might be rooted in measurable shifts to that integration process. Physiological senses that are usually quiet could, briefly, become more prominent in the overall picture the brain presents to itself as reality. Swart and others see the 34-sense framework as more than an academic curiosity. It's a reminder that human perception is an intricate, distributed system, one in which awareness is only the visible tip. The idea encourages a more generous view of what the brain might be doing in moments that feel out of the ordinary. And it's here that the conversation often moves toward the role of personal experience. When and how changes in this sensory integration map might intersect with life events powerful enough to reconfigure it. Because there are certain situations where something does appear to shift, not over decades of evolution, but in the space of weeks or months. It's not a laboratory-induced state or a biohacker's project. It's something people encounter in the course of ordinary life, often without warning, and it can leave them sensing the world in ways they hadn't before. How grief rewires the perceptual brain. When loss strikes, the emotional weight is obvious. But neurologically, grief functions as a reconfiguration. a process that reshapes how the brain processes and prioritizes information. Imaging studies over the past 2 decades, from early work by Gundel and colleagues to Mary Frances O'Connor's 2012 research, show that grief is not confined to emotion processing regions alone. It engages a wider network: emotional memory hubs such as the posterior cingulate cortex, the insula's interoceptive and emotional awareness circuits, and reward-related areas like the nucleus accumbens. During grief-related stimuli, these regions show heightened activation and altered connectivity, suggesting that perception itself, the sorting of what is signal and what is noise, is being recalibrated. In some individuals, this recalibration appears as a lowering of sensory thresholds. Experimental designs using faint auditory or visual patterns have found that recently bereaved participants can detect subtle cues more often than non-bereaved controls. Instead of discarding low-level sensory data, the brain seems more inclined to retain and route it into conscious awareness. Researchers describe it as a shift in gain control, with the system amplifying inputs that might normally be ignored. The result isn't supernatural. It's measurable changes in how sensory integration hubs operate under stress and attachment-related disruption. The insula's increased connectivity with sensory cortices is one example. This hub ordinarily filters and integrates internal bodily signals, heartbeat, breath, visceral states, with external cues. Under grief, that filter appears more permissive. The posterior cingulate, central to autobiographical memory, also shows stronger links to emotional and perceptual networks, perhaps explaining why reminders of the deceased, even fleeting, indirect ones, can feel immediate and vivid. Laboratory findings echo personal accounts. Some bereaved individuals report being attuned to tiny environmental shifts. A change in airflow in another room, a distant rhythmic sound masked for others by background noise, a flicker in peripheral vision. These perceptions align with known changes in the balance between emotion-driven networks and top-down regulatory regions, like the prefrontal cortex. O'Connor's work suggests that this altered state may be an adaptive mechanism. In disrupted environments, heightened sensitivity could aid survival by capturing more potentially relevant information. The depth of the relationship matters. Imaging analyses indicate that people with stronger emotional bonds to the deceased often show more pronounced neurofunctional changes. Enhanced crosstalk is observed between limbic regions, where emotional salience is processed, and prefrontal areas that direct attention and decision-making. This may underpin why certain cues, whether linked directly to the person or symbolically associated, capture attention so readily during early bereavement. Grief also triggers systemic physiological changes that may feed back into perception. Research points to fluctuations in neurotransmitter systems, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, associated with motivation, emotional tone, and alertness. While exact neurochemical cascades remain under study, O'Connor and others note that inflammation and immune responses are consistently implicated in grief physiology. Stress-induced inflammatory processes can influence brain function, possibly altering connectivity and the efficiency of neural signaling. The specifics of how these peripheral changes shape sensory integration are still being explored, but the link between acute stress, systemic responses, and altered perception is grounded in established biology. An unexpected parallel has emerged between certain grief-related brain states and those seen in altered consciousness practices. EEG and fMRI studies show that some grieving individuals exhibit patterns reminiscent of experienced meditators or trance practitioners. Elevated gamma synchrony across distant cortical areas, stronger alpha, theta coupling, and distinctive thalamocortical resonance. These patterns correlate with inward focus, modified time perception, and richer cross-modal integration. Models like Nelson's Neptune framework make the case that REM-like intrusion into waking states may help explain both some near-death experiences and pockets of unusual perception during profound emotional disruption. The resemblance doesn't confirm any non-local awareness, but it does outline plausible neural conditions for atypical experiences. Established clinical phenomena also remind us of the brain's capacity for the unexpected near the edges of life. Michael Nam and Alexander Bathiany's documented cases of terminal lucidity, where severely impaired individuals briefly regain clarity shortly before death, show that the nervous system can shift into different operating modes even late in decline. While distinct from bereavement, these cases underline that sudden, striking changes in cognition or perception can arise from transient changes in brain network dynamics. What does this look like in day-to-day life after a loss? Attention patterns tilt toward relevance for anything tied to the deceased. Eyes may scan familiar handwriting faster than other scripts. A trace of a familiar scent can halt movement mid-step. Acoustic changes in a space where the person once moved might provoke orientation before conscious recognition happens. From a resource perspective, this mode is costly, metabolically, because heightened sensory gain demands energy, and emotionally, because every detection is freighted with significance. These changes are not permanent for most people. Longitudinal imaging shows a trend toward baseline activity within 6 to 12 months, although some retain subtler shifts in sensitivity for longer. A few, often those who engage in ongoing contemplative or body-focused practices, may stabilize elements of the heightened integration beyond the acute stage. For them, grief effectively opened a door to a perceptual mode they later maintained intentionally. The overlap between this bereavement-induced state and intentional altered states offers one possible reason why post-loss anomalies, sensations of presence, vivid dreams, perceptions difficult to explain, are disproportionately reported in the weeks and months after a death. The nervous system, during that time, is already configured for greater integration across sensory and emotional channels, with less aggressive filtering by executive control systems. Whether the content of those moments originates internally, as a synthesis of cues and memories, or from an external source remains a matter of perspective and investigation. What is less in doubt is that grief modifies the very architecture of perception. This reconfiguration is why, in certain contexts, the boundary between ordinary sensory detection and experiences interpreted as extraordinary can blur. It creates conditions where small anomalies stand out, and where meaning is more readily attached to fleeting inputs. And it's within this neurobiological landscape that some turn toward practices or people who claim to mediate between the living and the dead, bringing us to another area where measurable data and contested claims intersect. What the new data says about mediumship accuracy. For many people, the default image of mediumship comes from television or stage shows. Broad guesses dressed up as revelation, plenty of prompting for clues, and an audience primed to agree. That stereotype makes mediumship easy to dismiss as theater. But when you move away from performances and look instead at certified, experienced practitioners working under strict experimental conditions, the results become harder to account for by performance tricks alone. In the past several years, a number of research groups have applied protocols designed to strip out all the usual paths for information leakage. A recent meta-analysis covering studies from 2001 to 2019, and only including those with the tightest controls, found modest but statistically reliable effects. Mediums performed roughly 6 to 14% above chance in high-control experiments. Under certain triple-blind protocols, the effects in individual studies were larger. One replication published in Explore reported that sitters correctly chose their intended readings 65.8% of the time, compared with 50% expected by chance. Another analysis found that those intended readings contained about 29.5% more correct statements than matched control readings. These numbers are not a blanket claim for all mediumship, but examples where performance exceeded what random guessing could produce. The methodology behind these findings is important to understand. A triple-blind protocol means the medium does not know who the sitter is. The sitter does not know which of 2 or more transcripts was meant for them. And wherever possible, the experimenters who handle the scoring step are also unaware of the match. In some setups, the only information given to the medium is the gender of the deceased. The reading is conducted without any live cues, often over anonymized phone lines or recorded offline. The transcript is later scored by a pool of sitters, none of whom are told in advance which reading is theirs. This approach removes the possibility of tailoring statements to immediate feedback, and it limits the influence of subtle prompts a sitter might give without realizing it. At the Windbridge Research Center, this framework is pushed further through a 5-level blinding strategy. All contact between mediums and sitters is removed. Even brief audio interactions are anonymized, and recordings are transcribed before the sitters score them. The intention is to close every channel, verbal, visual, or behavioral, through which information could travel in ordinary ways. In a dataset of 58 readings from 20 certified research mediums, scored by 116 sitters, the results provided statistical evidence that accuracy exceeded conventional explanations. Certified mediums tended to score higher than non-certified ones, suggesting that training, skill, or specific aptitude influences results. When accurate information appears, it often falls into several categories. The first are identifiers, habits, physical traits, or characteristic phrases that fit one deceased individual clearly. The second are references to events in the sitter's life that took place after the person's death, which are difficult to attribute to cold reading because they require no immediate feedback. The third are message-like statements, personalized sentiments or acknowledgements tied to shared experiences. While mainstream interpretation allows for coincidence and inference to account for some successes, the repetition of certain patterns, especially post-death event mentions, remains a challenging feature to reconcile with the conditions. Even so, most scientists in this area are careful with their conclusions. Above-chance results on their own do not prove that mediums are in contact with the consciousness of the dead. Competing hypotheses include information access through some kind of psi process that does not involve the deceased, or other, less explored cognitive mechanisms. Critics point out that small samples and the challenges of replication mean larger, pre-registered studies are still needed. The data so far establish that something is happening beyond random guessing under conditions designed to remove normal sensory routes, but they leave open the question of how. Context may also play a role. Some researchers have noted variations in medium performance linked to factors such as physical setting, mental preparation, or emotional state. These observations have prompted exploratory studies to test whether certain environments or pre-session activities influence outcomes. While results here are still preliminary, they underline that whatever underlies the effect may not be fixed. Performance might fluctuate with state as well as with skill. Pinning down such variables could be important for future protocol design. For those who approach the subject from a believing standpoint, the lab data feel like validation. For those who are skeptical, they raise a narrower but still important question. Why do some individuals produce correct details beyond chance when the standard channels are effectively blocked? Scientifically, the existence of an effect that is measurable and replicable under controlled constraints is enough to justify further research, regardless of which explanation eventually holds. The persistence of these findings, across different labs and years, adds a layer of credibility rare in work that is often marginalized. They have not overturned the caution of the wider scientific community, but they have shifted the conversation from one of outright dismissal to one where the effect itself is not in dispute, only the mechanism. That distinction explains why this area of study now intersects with broader questions about information transfer, perception, and the boundaries of current physical and biological models. Those questions expand quickly if you allow that verifiable information might sometimes emerge in ways not accounted for by known sensory processes. It invites, if cautiously, consideration of frameworks drawn from other scientific domains that deal with non-local correlations and linked systems. Frameworks that might offer entirely different ways of looking at exchanges between minds. Quantum threads, the entanglement hypothesis. Quantum threads. The entanglement hypothesis takes that curiosity about unexplained connections and asks whether the answer might lie in one of physics' most counterintuitive principles. Quantum entanglement describes a situation where two particles become linked so that the state of one is tied to the state of the other, no matter the distance between them. Change something about one, and the other changes in lockstep, not through a signal that travels, but as though they're part of the same whole. Einstein famously called it spooky action at a distance, and decades of laboratory work have shown it's real. It's precise enough to support secure communications and the operation of quantum computers. Why would this interest people who study the mind? The brain is also a highly connected system, with billions of neurons exchanging information constantly. If certain biological structures could support quantum effects like entanglement, they might provide an additional form of linkage, more subtle than chemical or electrical signals, that could contribute to how experiences and perceptions are integrated. The big obstacle has always been the environment. Most physicists will point out that the brain's warm, wet, and noisy chemistry is exactly the sort of place where delicate quantum states should quickly collapse, a process called decoherence. Alberto Casas, a leading theoretical physicist, has said flatly that macroscopic entanglement between brains is not supported by standard quantum mechanics, and any speculation needs extraordinary evidence. Still, a handful of technical leads have kept the hypothesis alive as a line of inquiry. Some lab studies, including work in 2019 and a 2025 paper in Physical Review E, suggest that biology might find ways to protect quantum states longer than expected. This includes evidence that the fatty myelin sheath around some axons could act like a tiny optical cavity, emitting entangled photons at body temperature. Other groups have reported coherence-like effects in isolated microtubules, the structural elements within neurons. Both lines of research remain preliminary and are debated heavily, but they point to potential mechanisms by which warm tissue might manage a feat thought impossible a generation ago. Within this speculative space sit theories like Penrose and Hameroff's orchestrated objective reduction, ORCHOR, which proposes that microtubules within neurons host quantum processes linked to consciousness. The ORCHOR model has its supporters and a long list of critics. Many neuroscientists see no need to invoke quantum mechanics to explain awareness, while many physicists argue the brain is too noisy for sustained quantum coherence. Yet the idea has persisted, partly because certain problems in neuroscience, such as the binding problem, uniting different sensory inputs into one cohesive experience, still lack a universally accepted classical solution. On the exploratory frontier, researchers like Hartmut Neven at Google's Quantum Artificial Intelligence Lab have begun outlining experimental designs to test for quantum effects in the brain more directly. These proposals range from looking for subtle quantum signatures in neural activity to, at least in theory, coupling parts of a living brain to a quantum processor to see whether changes in the quantum system correspond to changes in conscious state. Neven has linked this to broader interpretations of quantum mechanics, including the possibility that consciousness itself might be tied to selecting a single path through a constantly branching reality. These concepts are far from consensus, even the most optimistic researchers admit they are at the earliest stages and may never yield positive results. If, in principle, quantum processes could contribute to human awareness, then two conscious systems, whether two people or a person and something else complex enough, might share correlations beyond ordinary sensory exchange. Some even suggest that under rare or intense conditions, such a connection could persist briefly if one system's biological activity stopped, because quantum correlations are not bound by the same decay pathways as electrical firing or neurotransmitters. That's not a claim of proof. It's a hypothetical mechanism that fits within certain interpretations of quantum theory and within the small class of biological results that hint at coherence. Experiments with living participants have occasionally hinted at mind-to-mind patterns that are hard to fold neatly into classical explanations. In one 2025 study, experienced meditators in different countries entered sustained states of focus at scheduled times while connected to EEG systems in secure labs thousands of kilometers apart. Researchers reported statistically significant synchrony in their brainwave patterns, especially in gamma frequencies linked to attention and sensory integration during those exact intervals. Careful controls ruled out mundane sources, such as equipment drift or coincidental environmental cues. These results didn't prove entanglement. Other, non-quantum explanations remain possible, but they kept alive the question of whether the brain might participate in kinds of correlation we don't yet fully understand. Physically, you might picture entanglement as starting with two coins that always land opposite sides no matter the distance between them. In the quantum case, the outcome is set only when one is flipped, and somehow the other matches instantly, regardless of space separating them. Replace those coins with the states of certain neural assemblies in theory, and you can imagine why some speculate about shared mental states. The sticking point is that unlike the engineered qubits in a lab, the brain is noisy and uncontrolled. Any entangled states would have to be regenerated constantly or sheltered in microscopic environments that dampen disruption, like the proposed myelin cavities. Mainstream neuroscience maintains that all cognitive phenomena observed so far can be explained by known biological and physical processes. From that perspective, introducing quantum mechanics is unnecessary unless it provides testable predictions that outperform current models. Advocates of the quantum view respond that certain hard problems of consciousness, and possibly some anomalous perceptual reports, might be better addressed if non-classical information integration were permitted by biology. In relation to after-death experiences, the entanglement suggestion is not about an ongoing exchange of complex messages. It's about whether vestiges of correlation could exist that are not immediately broken when biological life ends. In such a scenario, certain mental states deep focus, altered consciousness, or intense emotion, might be better suited to picking up on them. That would match anecdotal clustering of unusual perceptions around moments of deliberate thought about the deceased rather than during unrelated daily activities. The meditator synchrony study also hints that shared intention matters. The correlations that were observed occurred during mutual commitment to a mental act, not at random points. If there is a quantum element, context might be critical, but without a way to measure it directly in the brain and distinguish it from other explanations, the idea stays in the realm of informed speculation. Working at this edge of science involves long timelines. Many proposed tests, like coupling a brain to a functioning quantum processor, aren't possible with current technology. Even smaller-scale experiments aimed at identifying protected quantum states in neural tissue face significant technical barriers. For now, researchers collect small pieces of evidence: unusual synchrony patterns, lab signs of quantum effects in biological structures, and proposals for tests that might one day be feasible. That incremental approach can feel unsatisfying, especially when questions are this big. But each data point helps define whether entanglement in the brain belongs in the category of plausible future science, or in the growing file of ideas that turned out not to match reality. And that's where this conversation inevitably meets a more familiar reaction, one that mixes humor, dismissal, and a raised eyebrow. Skepticism, after all, is not just expected, it's necessary. Humor, skeptics, and the spaghetti monster problem. There's a certain type of smirk that shows up whenever this subject is raised, part amusement, part polite dismissal. For many, it's hard to take the idea of after-death communication seriously when the popular image is blurred by TV psychics, dramatic pauses, and anecdotes about kitchen appliances sending messages from beyond. That's where the spaghetti monster problem comes in. More than a joke, it's a reminder. If you accept a claim without evidence, you have to accept any claim, no matter how absurd, on the same terms. The flying spaghetti monster was created as satire to illustrate this. And it works. Extraordinary claims need standards that match their weight. Holding that standard, though, only works if it's paired with a willingness to test. Insisting, "I'll believe it when I see it," is hollow if you never build the conditions that might make something visible. That difference between healthy skepticism and reflexive dismissal matters. Skepticism at its best asks to see the map, and is willing to walk the unmarked paths if there's a chance they lead somewhere. Without that, science stalls. And history is full of cases where what seemed impossible was only waiting for someone to measure it correctly. This isn't an argument to lower the bar, it's an argument to walk toward it. If you look at the history of technology, driverless cars are a clean example. 20 years ago, sending a car through a busy intersection without a human hand on the wheel sounded like a scene from speculative fiction. The sensors couldn't resolve enough detail. The neural networks controlling vehicles were too limited. High-precision mapping at that scale didn't exist. But improved machine vision, rapid learning algorithms, and faster processors changed the picture faster than skeptics expected. Now the arguments are about regulation and edge case safety, not possibility. Biology tells a similar story. For most of the last century, the model of human vision was restricted to rods and cones. Those were the light-sensing cells you learned about in textbooks, the entire picture. In the late 1990s, hints appeared of a third photoreceptor in the eye. The idea was dismissed. How could something so basic have been missed? But experiments confirmed melanopsin-containing cells forming a separate light-sensing network, influencing circadian rhythms and pupil reflexes independently of rods and cones. A sensory pathway had been operating unnoticed for as long as humans existed, recognized only because researchers challenged the assumption that nothing else was there. These examples don't make a case for any specific outcome in consciousness research, but they do make clear that absurd and impossible aren't fixed categories. They shift when data accumulates. That's why the spaghetti monster is a useful guidepost rather than a barricade. Use it to keep speculation accountable to evidence, but don't let it block you from tests that could produce that evidence in the first place. Applied to claims like consciousness can survive biological death, or people can correctly report information from the deceased, the same principle holds. If the claim is false, rigor will show that. If it's true in any form, avoiding the test delays recognition. The most practical position is to maintain strict conditions, pre-registered experiments, clear scoring criteria, replication attempts, and balance them with enough openness to let the results emerge. The adversarial collaboration model offers a good precedent. In 2023, teams at the Allen Institute structured experiments to pit integrated information theory against global neuronal workspace theory, agreeing on protocols in advance despite disagreeing strongly on the expected outcome. That kind of design forces the work to stand on shared ground, even in a contested space. Fraud, error, and misinterpretation are real hazards in this field. A cautious approach is essential, and there's nothing wrong with asking every detail of how a study was done. The difference comes when scrutiny is coupled with a baseline willingness to look. Healthy skepticism demands precision, but it also accepts that if results meet that precision, the conversation should move forward. That's what happened in areas that once seemed outlandish. Meteorites, germ theory, tectonic plates, each denied until confirmed. Scientists themselves are not immune to bias toward existing models. Protecting a framework feels safer than risking revision. Yet shifts often come from researchers stepping into areas beyond their initial expertise. Some who built careers in conventional neuroscience now collaborate on tests for quantum processes in the brain. They are explicit about the low odds of confirming certain theories, but they still engage with the work because the possibility, however slim, is testable. This isn't about belief. It's about aligning investigative effort with coherent, falsifiable hypotheses. Humor helps when the subject matter carries cultural baggage. Joking about a spaghetti-based deity creates room to acknowledge the risk of chasing unfounded ideas while signaling that questions are still on the table. You can point to the absurdity as a reminder of why standards matter, then outline the experiment you'd run to find out whether the claim holds. In the end, the design and execution of that experiment are what give an answer credibility, not the comfort level people bring to the question. If the future verdict on after-death communication research is that all above chance results were byproducts of bias, flawed randomization, or unrecognized signal leakage, that will become clear through replication and control. If instead, large-scale, pre-registered tests keep producing deviations from chance under robust blinding, the discussion will shift away from could happen to does happen. Under what mechanism? That progression doesn't require abandoning skepticism, only applying it evenly. Until then, the spaghetti monster works best as a friendly specter at the edge of the discussion, a reminder to check what's on the plate rather than walk out of the kitchen. Evidence, tested under conditions the critical and the curious can both accept, is how we move ideas from the fringe into the body of accepted knowledge. And as past discoveries show, many of the systems we now call obvious spent years in that uneasy in-between space. From here, the next step is to focus more closely on what might change in the brain itself when perception seems to widen, not in terms of abstract theory, but in the tangible processes running beneath awareness. Those changes may help explain why in certain states, the world appears to carry more information than usual. The neurochemistry of heightened perception. Beneath every scan or electrical trace, there is chemistry shaping what we can and can't perceive. In the weeks and months after a major loss, that chemistry shifts. Neurotransmitters, hormones, and immune messengers adjust their levels, changing the environment in which neurons operate. Those changes are not abstract. They directly alter the brain's thresholds for noticing, filtering, and prioritizing sensory information. One of the systems most often discussed in this context is serotonin. Best known for its role in mood regulation, serotonin also influences sensory processing and microvascular tone. The serotonin hypothesis of trauma, discussed by Dr. Tara Swart, proposes that stressful or traumatic experiences may partially encode themselves through sustained changes in capillary constriction and nutrient delivery to tissues such as skin, fascia, and muscles. These physical imprints could create a long-lived feedback loop to the brain, reinforcing the memory of the event. As a hypothesis, it still needs more empirical validation, but it offers a biological rationale for why grief can feel embodied as much as emotional. This is also why body-oriented approaches, singing, dancing, massage, or targeted movement, are sometimes recommended as adjuncts in grief care. By physically changing circulation or tissue tension, such practices might interrupt the chemical signals that keep the trauma loop active. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter that changes pattern during early bereavement. It governs motivation and reward processing, but is also central to salience, deciding which inputs matter enough to draw attention. In cases of prolonged grief disorder, PGD, and in acute yearning, research reviewed by Coccarola and and seen in studies by O'Connor shows altered function in reward circuitry, including the nucleus accumbens. This can mean that cues linked to the deceased, certain objects, places, scents, or sounds, carry an exaggerated pull, while unrelated stimuli fade into the background. Fluctuating dopamine levels can sharpen the contrast between significant and insignificant, making people more likely to notice faint or ambiguous cues tied to loss. Oxytocin, better known for its role in social bonding, has also been implicated. A 2019 study by Bowie and colleagues found altered oxytocin levels in individuals with PGD. Because oxytocin affects both emotional attachment systems and certain sensory processing pathways, changes to its regulation could influence how strongly people respond to subtle interpersonal or environmental cues that symbolize connection. In grief, that might mean a heightened attunement to anything resembling the presence or reminders of the person who is gone. These neurochemical adjustments occur alongside immune and inflammatory responses that are now recognized as part of grief physiology. Microglia, the brain's resident immune cells, become more active under stress, and preliminary evidence suggests increased microglial activation in early bereavement. Inflammation-related molecules can alter neuronal excitability and modulate the strength of connections between brain regions. Current work stops short of proving that microglia store trauma, but it does support the view that immune signaling is entangled with how grieving brains process emotion and sensory data. Inflammation could, in principle, make certain neural pathways more active or more tightly linked, especially between memory regions and sensory cortices, but more definitive causal data are still ahead. The immune link leads naturally to the gut-brain axis. The gut is both an immune organ and a site of neurotransmitter production, making diet, microbiome balance, and digestion potential modifiers of brain state. Grief often disrupts appetite and digestion, which in turn can shift gut microbiota composition. Those shifts can affect immune signaling and, indirectly, brain chemistry. Research on diet, probiotics, and anti-inflammatory interventions is still emerging in this specific context, but evidence from other stress-related states suggests that gut health can influence the intensity and stability of sensory perception. Maintaining gut function through balanced nutrition, hydration, and activity may help moderate perception changes, though this remains a developing area of study. Some of the same pathways affected by grief chemistry show up in altered states reached through intentional practices. For example, mindfulness meditation and structured breathwork can influence serotonin and dopamine regulation, modulate inflammation, and change patterns of connectivity between key brain regions. The 2019 fMRI study by Huang and colleagues found that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy in bereaved individuals was associated with changes in executive control and emotion regulation circuits, suggesting a capacity to actively shape the grieving brain's functional state. Breathing techniques offer a non-pharmacological way to influence blood oxygen and carbon dioxide balance, which in turn affects brain pH and neurotransmitter behavior. Adjusting CO2 levels through slow breathing exercises, alternate nostril breathing, or cyclic variations can measurably alter brainwave patterns, enhancing theta for relaxed focus, or shifting alpha and gamma rhythms linked to sensory gating and integration. This overlap means breathwork can sometimes reproduce certain perceptual qualities common in grief: heightened clarity, expanded awareness, without the destabilizing emotional input of loss. Because the underlying mechanisms are chemical and physiological, these modulation methods are accessible outside of crisis. Body-oriented practices may release muscular or facial tension associated with trauma. Breathwork can momentarily rebalance neurochemistry in ways that change perception. Diet and gut care can dampen inflammatory processes that might otherwise amplify sensory salience. Clinical guidelines for trauma often combine cognitive and somatic components precisely because they act on both mind and body channels of the stress system. Rather than a single switch for heightened perception, bereavement appears to create a layered shift. Serotonin changes may loosen the filter on incoming signals. Dopamine may weight certain cues more heavily. Oxytocin adjustments might increase attunement to relational or social markers. Immune activation and inflammation can temporarily strengthen the links between expressive emotion and sensory processing. And self-directed interventions like breath control, movement, or diet can nudge these systems toward balance. The combined effect is a brain state configured for intensity, scanning more broadly and weighting signals differently than in ordinary life. From a scientific standpoint, this framing removes the need to treat heightened perception during grief as mysterious or inherently supernatural, without stripping it of meaning. The system is objectively more receptive, integrating signals, whether from the senses or from memory traces, that it might normally filter out. The content of those signals, and how they are interpreted, remains personal and context-dependent. The emerging toolkit for influencing these pathways suggests that such perceptual openness may not need to be left entirely to chance or to the aftermath of loss. With an understanding of the chemistry involved, it becomes possible to explore sensory expansion deliberately under safe and repeatable conditions. That doesn't answer the larger questions about the origins of any given perception, but it does open a path for controlled self-study. And in the same way researchers have mapped how grief alters neurochemistry, they have also begun to outline practical ways to work with these changes once you know they exist. Because grasping the biology is one thing, learning how to engage with it in your own mind is another entirely. Practical framework to develop your intuitive communication. For anyone interested in applying this in their own life, there's a structured way to work toward clearer intuitive communication. In 2025, Dr. Tara Swartz's tested framework stood out for its grounded, repeatable approach. It treats intuitive awareness as a skill set that can be improved through consistent practice, not an innate gift restricted to a few people. The method is built on 4 interconnected pillars, each aimed at a different part of how we notice, process, and interpret incoming information. Nothing here requires mystical belief. It's closer to physical training. Instead of conditioning muscles, you are conditioning perceptual and interpretive systems. The first pillar is nature immersion. This goes beyond sitting outdoors to relax. It's the deliberate use of unmediated natural environments, woodland, gardens, coastal paths, open water edges, to expose your senses to unpredictable, layered stimuli. The shifting angle of light through leaves, subtle wind changes on the skin, the irregular spacing of bird calls. Research, including Swartz's own, suggests that regular exposure to these settings enhances novelty salience and improves mood regulation. In the context of this framework, participants who scheduled 3 device-free sessions, a week of 20 to 40 minutes, started reporting benefits within a couple of months. Though the early weeks can feel uneventful as the brain readjusts to slower, less filtered input streams. The second pillar is sensory noticing drills. These train the brain to reduce its automatic filtering, so low-level cues are less likely to be discarded. Each exercise focuses on one sense at a time. 5 minutes of sound tracking volume, tone and rhythm without naming sources. A visual scan for color gradients, edge definition, and peripheral motion. Close attention to tactile signals like temperature variance or texture. Over time, senses can be paired for more complex drills. Swartz links this practice to the art of noticing in her broader work, and neuroscientific studies on perception and neuroaesthetics indicate that trained observational focus can alter how stimuli are prioritized in the brain. The short-term goal isn't to generate insights on command, but to lower detection thresholds so relevant cues register more often in daily life. The third pillar, creativity practice, targets the cognitive machinery involved in spotting novelty. Many forms work: sketching, improvisational music, free writing. But the key is creating without pre-planning the finished product. This disrupts habitual patterning and reduces the dominance of the brain's default mode network, freeing more bandwidth for unexpected connections. Swartz notes that this taps mechanisms similar to low-latent inhibition, where the mind admits more stimuli for processing. In her review, regular creative output was linked to heightened novelty salience within a month. That means the brain flags deviations from the familiar more readily, which can be a critical part of both everyday problem-solving and intuitive leaps. The fourth pillar is interoceptive training, cultivating awareness of your own internal signals. This is as simple as sitting still for a few minutes each day and tracking heartbeat, breath depth, muscular tension, or gut sensations without changing them. Over time, this extends into correlating these signals with emotional shifts and decisions. O'Connor's grief research and Swartz's work on the gut brain axis highlight that interoception is deeply tied to emotion and intuition. Practiced regularly, it can reveal which internal cues tend to accompany accurate judgments or important observations, giving you a personal data set to work from. The real strength of the framework lies in the way these elements interact. Time spent in quiet natural settings can stabilize attention for sensory drills. Creative work can reduce rigidity in interpreting novel inputs. Interoceptive detail can signal when an external cue truly matters to you. In Dr. Swartz's trials, people integrating all 4 pillars 4 or 5 days each week demonstrated measurable gains in intuitive decision-making tasks within 8 weeks. Improvements weren't just self-reported. Accuracy increased in controlled choice tests, where relevant cues were embedded in distracting information. This mirrors results from the 2019 Huang Mindfulness study, which found that 8 weeks of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy in bereaved participants improved both reaction times and emotion regulation in fMRI testing, showing that targeted mental training can reshape performance and neural patterns in that time frame. There's also a valuable social dimension. Skills calibrate faster in a community setting. Peers can help you check whether what you noticed was present and relevant, and share failures as well as successes. Without that feedback loop, it's easier to slide into overconfidence or dismiss emerging ability. Many of the most successful applications of this framework use periodic group check-ins or partner exercises for this reason. Humor has a place here too. Paying close attention to the flicker of supermarket fern leaves isn't a requirement, and displaying your efforts in public isn't the point. Much of this work happens quietly, in everyday life. The goal is a shift in your baseline, not a performance. An extension of the sensory drills is the art of noticing beauty, actively seeking and holding attention on aesthetic details you find appealing. It builds on gratitude practice, but with a sharper link to perception. Swart notes that this can raise oxytocin levels, gently altering mood and receptivity. Over time, it carves a habit loop where anything striking is given a pause, creating a moment where more subtle cues can surface. Measured effects will vary, and the early stages may draw more attention to how much you usually miss than to any dramatic increase in perception. Most experiences in the short term will be subtle, catching background noises faster, spotting an out-of-place object sooner. Over a longer period, some find they can feel the rightness or offness of a decision before conscious reasoning catches up, with better-than-chance accuracy. Swart is clear that the aim isn't to guarantee extraordinary experiences, but to build the foundation that keeps you open to them if they occur. It's worth adding that these exercises are not a substitute for professional treatment in cases of complicated grief or other mental health challenges. They can complement therapy and self-care, particularly for people with milder grief or those looking to strengthen general intuitive awareness. The first tangible changes often happen between the 4th and 8th week for those practicing consistently. Beyond that, some expand into more complex versions of each pillar, while others maintain a lighter routine to keep perceptual skills engaged. Either way, the accumulated effect is a different daily landscape. Commonplace details stand out. Unrelated cues start forming patterns. And now and then, one of those moments aligns so well with external validation that it alters your sense of what information you're able to access. Understanding the mechanics is useful, but the question remains whether changes in perception alone account for all observed results. That's where ongoing research comes in, testing whether trained awareness can be linked to measurable brain activity that points to connections beyond the expected. The new imaging proof of non-local awareness. By early 2025, several labs were starting to use more daring neuroimaging protocols to test questions that, until recently, had been left mostly to speculation. The driving idea was straightforward but ambitious. Could you observe, in real time, measurable patterns in a living brain that showed consistent correlations with some external or pre-recorded signal not accessible through the person's ordinary senses? The focus was on second-by-second tracking rather than averages taken after the fact, the aim being to remove uncertainties about memory or delayed interpretation. For researchers, the real challenge was designing a setup where any match would have to occur without sensory contact, and without the participant or the analysts knowing what signal they were being compared to during the test. One line of work took the form of inter-subject correlation studies, building on prior results from meditation research. In these designs, 2 or more people, often separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers, agreed to enter a specific sustained mental state, sometimes at exactly timed intervals, while their neural activity was recorded. A 2025 study with experienced meditators in different countries used high-density EEG to look for synchronized patterns across participants. During the agreed focus periods, statistical analysis found above-chance synchrony, particularly in gamma bands associated with attention and sensory integration. Outside those intervals, the synchrony dropped to baseline. Because the participants had no live communication and no sensory contact, the correlations remained unexplained by obvious environmental cues, though researchers emphasized that non-quantum explanations were still possible. Another approach involved testing nearer to critical medical events. Inspired by earlier proposals covered in outlets such as El País, teams began installing concealed visual targets in certain hospital resuscitation bays and cardiac theaters. The logic was that if a patient undergoing cardiac arrest later reported verifiable details about the hidden target, and their brain data from that interval could be recovered, it would offer a rare point of comparison between subjective report and physiological recording. At the time of writing, these trials had not produced confirmed hits. Most patients had no recall, and intensive care conditions made meaningful matching difficult. But even the negative results were seen as important for shaping future methodology. The most high-profile example of rigorous design came from the Allen Institute's 2025 adversarial collaboration, comparing two competing consciousness theories: integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace theory. The teams agreed in advance on protocols, stimuli, and analysis methods, and carried out blinded, pre-registered tests. While the results did not confirm either theory decisively, they did show that shared standards and independent replication are possible even when underlying hypotheses are contentious. Observers both inside and outside the project have pointed to this model as a template for any future work that might attempt to probe so-called non-local effects. In all these studies, the key principle was separation between the people generating the data and any signal they might be unknowingly matching, and between those collecting the data and those doing the analysis. Without this separation, subtle cues, intentional or not, could distort the results. In the synchronous meditation trials, for example, participants were given times, but no details of what brain regions or frequencies were of interest, and the analysts received only anonymized datasets labeled to mark the designated focus and control intervals. Explaining why such work is interesting does not mean overinterpreting it. Inter-subject correlations do not prove that minds can communicate without a medium, and synchronized EEG rhythms do not necessarily reflect shared content. They could be byproducts of following the same instructions, of subtle environmental synchronization, or of coincidental alignment within broad brain oscillation patterns. The reason researchers persist is that repeatedly finding structured correlation, above what would occur randomly, under highly constrained conditions, suggests there may be overlooked variables worth identifying. Some propose that refining these protocols might reveal new dimensions of how brains may align through common focus or intention, even if the mechanism remains within standard biology. For the subset of scientists open to testing more speculative scenarios, for example, whether training in attentional and sensory practices changes the likelihood of unusual correlations, the current consensus is that any convincing evidence will require the same discipline as in the Allen Institute project. Independent groups agreeing on tightly controlled conditions before collecting data, pre-registering their predictions and analysis strategies, and publishing complete datasets for independent reanalysis. There is also growing interest in combining modalities. EEG offers speed, tracking changes on the scale of milliseconds, but is noisy. fNIRS offers complementary slower hemodynamic mapping and is more portable than fMRI. Magnetoencephalography provides finer spatial localization for certain frequency bands. By layering these, a future study could capture both transient synchrony and sustained network changes in response to the same stimulus window. But these designs demand substantial resources and, critically, enough trials to distinguish true effects from statistical noise. Another refinement would be to expand control conditions. In the meditator synchrony models, future replications may include sham, intervals in which participants are told an experiment is active when it is not, to check for expectancy effects. In hospital target trials, controls could include identical equipment in comparable units where no arrest events occur. All of these steps are aimed at shutting down the avenues by which ordinary processes could mimic the patterns being sought. The cautious language used by the leading groups reflects how early this work is. Intriguing is not the same as proven, and the gap between a statistical relationship and a verified mechanism is large. Yet by establishing repeatable conditions where correlations can be measured directly and independently of subjective report, These early protocols offer one more incremental way to test ideas that have often been dismissed outright. What they do not offer, at least so far, is confirmation of non-local awareness as a fact. Synchrony across continents, brain state alignment in shared focus, or failed attempts in clinical settings all leave room for interpretation. But they also expand the toolkit for examining questions about perception, intention, and connection with methods that meet contemporary neuroscientific standards. The immediate benefit may lie in the byproducts rather than the headline claims. Participants, even in null-result trials, often describe increased mental clarity, reduced stress, and a stronger sense of connection after committing to structured attentional practice. Those changes might be relevant in their own right, regardless of whether more exotic effects are ever confirmed. And for research teams, the legacy may be the methods themselves. Detailed, transparent designs that make the strongest case possible for whatever the data actually show. In that sense, the 2025 wave of experiments marks less a breakthrough than a sharpening of tools. Observations that once lived entirely in anecdote are starting to be placed into testable frameworks, albeit with results that remain ambiguous. Whether those tests ultimately confirm, weaken, or redirect the more speculative interpretations, the practice of running them under discipline has value. For people outside the lab, this momentum raises a different kind of question, not about what distant or hard-to-explain connections might exist, but about what this kind of directed attention means for how we conduct ourselves day to day. Because when the instruments are switched off, all that remains is the way you choose to notice, interpret, and act on the signals already within reach. Why this matters for how we live now. At its core, this research is about what happens when small shifts in attention start to influence the way we actually live. The mechanisms explored in earlier sections aren't only relevant to unusual or rare experiences. They're the same systems that shape purpose, connection, and how actively we participate in the world around us. These qualities have clear, measurable ties to health, decision-making, and the organization of the brain over time. In grief studies, Mary Frances O'Connor and others have noted that purpose and meaning play a critical role in recovery, with stronger purpose linked to better coping and resilience. Catherine Shear and Camille Wertman have similarly emphasized that fostering connection and meaning can improve quality of life, not only for the bereaved, but for anyone at risk of social or psychological isolation. Purpose here doesn't mean a single defining mission to last a lifetime. It can be as modest as something you care about that consistently extends your attention beyond your own comfort and survival. People who sustain that kind of outward engagement tend to show higher well-being in surveys and follow UPS. There's a reinforcing loop at work. Engaging with something that matters builds a sense of stability, which makes it easier to make deliberate choices, and that stability tends to draw other people in. Over time, those individual points of contact can develop into community. Clinical reports make it clear that this process is not rare. Qualitative studies from bereavement interventions show that when grieving individuals engage in community roles, creative projects, or support work, their perspective begins to shift outward. Sensory and attentional practices, sometimes embedded in those activities, help break up the closed circuit of distress. As people broaden what they notice in their surroundings, they often begin to register cues about others' needs, or spot ways to contribute that they might otherwise have missed. The benefits aren't reserved for those starting from a place of belief in anything beyond the material. Studies on attentional noticing find similar improvements in life satisfaction among participants, whether they approach the practice from a spiritual perspective or not. Even self-identified skeptics who practice structured sensory awareness reported enhanced engagement and mood. These outcomes align with the basic neuroscience. The more present and observant you are, the more accurately and quickly you can respond to what's actually happening around you. One of the most direct applications of this is the simple act of noticing beauty. Whether it's light falling in a certain way, an unexpected line in a piece of music, or the way someone gestures, holding your attention on that detail for a short time can raise oxytocin levels. Oxytocin is tied to social bonding and feelings of well-being. Over repetitions, this becomes a habit of registering small positives, which can shift mood states and subtly influence behavior. Not just in the moment, but in the tendency to seek and share such moments more often. Novelty salience plays a similar role. As creative work and time in unstructured natural settings increase the brain's sensitivity to what's new or unexpected, people become more able to catch subtle variations, in color, sound, tone of voice, or expression. That broadens the range of cues you register and expands your choices in how to respond. Such awareness is just as useful in everyday situations like conversations, decision-making, and collaborative work as it is in more esoteric domains. Attention at this level often makes the difference between false and true connection. False connection is transactional, treating interactions as a quick exchange for personal gain. True connection means registering another person's inner state and responding with care, without calculating immediate benefit. That sort of reciprocity builds trust over time, and it leaves a longer imprint in memory than the specific content of any one exchange. In societies leaning toward greater individualism, that deeper layer of connection doesn't happen reliably by chance. It usually has to be cultivated. Sensory and attentional practices make it more likely that you'll notice the opportunities when they arise. The moment to check in with a colleague who seems withdrawn, the chance to stop and help, or the subtle sign that someone is inviting you into a more genuine exchange. For someone in the raw stages of grief, that outward shift can mark an inflection point. It doesn't erase the reality of loss, but it reintroduces other sources of engagement and meaning. For those not in grief, the same shift can prevent life from narrowing into familiar routes and shallow exchanges. It makes it more likely that your days will include instances of attention that feel worthwhile in themselves. The durability of these changes is another point the data supports. In Follow UPS, conducted months after structured practice programs had ended, some participants retained the higher life satisfaction they'd reported immediately after training, even without daily practice. Those who built the exercises into simple ongoing routines, a few minutes of sensory focus, short creative sessions, or brief, regular immersion in nature, were more likely to maintain both perceptual acuity and a sense of connection. That persistence matters because the qualities we've discussed, sustained attention, broader sensory range, genuine connection, are not only relevant in the rare context of anomalous perception, they make ordinary days richer and relationships stronger. They work without requiring any stance on the existence of non-local awareness, because they operate through mechanisms well described by neuroscience and psychology. When people describe these practices as life-changing, they often mean the accumulation of small, steady shifts rather than a single dramatic moment. Slower reactions, greater sensitivity to surroundings, and more deliberate responses build into a different experience of time and interaction. The changes can be subtle enough to overlook if you expect a sudden breakthrough, but noticeable when you compare weeks or months. This is why their value is independent of any position on after-death communication. The core disciplines, nature immersion, creative engagement, intentional sensory noticing, strengthen capacities that apply across contexts, in family dynamics, professional environments, and self-care. Evidence from controlled trials shows that even short interventions have measurable effects. Just one example. Spending 20 minutes in a natural environment without a device has been shown to improve attention and mood in the hours that follow. A simple, practical recommendation is to try that this week and notice what changes, however small. The fact that benefits appear in both believers and skeptics is one of the clearest takeaways from the 2025 research. Working with the parts of the practice that are measurable doesn't require committing to explanations for the rest. You can start with one concrete step, looking a little longer at a single detail in your day, or setting aside a device-free 20-minute walk outdoors, and treat the result as data in your own personal experiment. Over time, these small actions engage systems that not only make life more engaging, but also leave you better equipped for moments when rare or unexplained perceptions do occur. Whether or not those moments become the focus, you've built a reliable framework for attention and connection in the present. And that foundation is what makes the larger questions worth approaching at all. Because the same skills that prepare us to explore what's unresolved in science also strengthen how we live within what's already in reach. Across all of this work, a few points stand out. A single-case EEG study in Frontiers suggested the brain's shutdown is more complex than a simple on-off switch. Meta-analyses and triple-blind experiments show small, but reliable above-chance effects in controlled mediumship. Imaging and biochemical studies by O'Connor, Gundel, Coccarola, and Bowie confirm that grief reshapes perception and chemistry. And low-risk practices, nature immersion, sensory noticing, creative work, interoceptive awareness, already improve focus, mood, and connection, as supported by Mindfulness and MBCT research. This week, try 20 minutes outside without your phone and 5 minutes on a single sense noticing drill. Note one change in your attention. If you try it, tell us one small thing you noticed in the comments.